After 18 hours in the air, 10,000 cheer the end of the epical flight as the Lady Lindy slides into a perfect landing. The first woman to fly the Pacific and the first person to fly it solo. Roses to Amelia and the plaudits of the world to a veteran of flights that have shown the way for aviation's progress. It's her most brilliant chapter in a 16-year aviation career.
A short time ago, Amelia Earhart checked over every detail of her $80,000 flying laboratory. This was to have been her greatest achievement, a sky dash of 28,000 miles. To a waiting world came news of disaster as the plane failed to reach tiny Howland Island in mid-Pacific. A British freighter, the Coast Guard, and the Navy sped to the search. With 3,000 men and 72 planes aboard, races into the distant Pacific to join the greatest searching party in the history of aviation.
Joe Jervis is an ex-Air Force major who not only thinks Amelia flew a spy mission, but that she survived it as well.
And I looked at her straight in the face, and I knew who it was, just like that.
A fantastic story which makes me out to be some kind of a mystery woman who is undoubtedly Amelia Earhart is utter nonsense.
The great fathoms of our past have many unexplained mysteries that leave scholars, the public, and everybody in between confused. Possibly one of the most recent examples and greatest examples of this is the harrowing vanishing of Amelia Earhart, the woman who owned the skies. 22,000 miles done, and only 7,000 to go before she could hold the title of the first female pilot to conquer the feat of circumnavigating Mother Earth. She was so close that victory was palpable. However, somewhere in that 7,000-mile stretch between the islands off of Japan and the USA, something happened. And that something would mean the untimely end to Earhart's historic journey. Many propose answers to the question of Earhart's whereabouts, yet none of these provide closure. Hearsay isn't fact, as it seems. Did Earhart crash land and get consumed by crabs on a remote island in the Pacific? Did her plane get shot down by the Japanese and the evidence was covered up? Did she land safe and sound and take a new name and assume a new identity to live out her older years outside of the limelight? Did she get abducted by aliens? Did she ever actually take flight? Was she used as some sort of pawn by the USA as a way to infiltrate the Marshall Islands of Japan? So many questions and a stark lack of answers. In this video, I will be examining the historic life of Amelia Earhart with a focus on her infamous final voyage around the globe. I will dive headfirst into the theories, the conspiracies, and most importantly, the discrepancies regarding her vanishing, and I'll present it all to you in a way where you can draw your own conclusions. Because until evidence is found to support any one of these theories, the Amelia Earhart discrepancy will haunt aviators, citizens, and the histories for as long as we can continue to remember them. So sit back, grab some Reese's Pieces, grab a cold Dr. Pepper, and get that tinfoil hat out of the closet. You're gonna need it in the end of the video. And without further ado, let's get into this. Amelia Mary Earhart was born on July 24th, 1897, to a loving family in Atchison, Kansas. Now, I will not be going into her life story extensively, her raising and all of that, but I will be summarizing and glossing over the high points that lead up to this grand circumnavigation of the world. However, I will link a fantastic documentary about Earhart's legacy and life in the description below, and if you want all the details of her upbringing, her family, and everything about her career, I recommend checking that video out. But if you want the Cliff Notes version of it, and then a deep dive into the theories and the mysteries of her vanishing, this video's for you. As a child, Earhart was passionate about adventure. She took a fierce and determined personality late into her teens and early 20s. This eventually manifested in an interest in flying aircrafts. Before any of that, though, she entered the war effort in World War I and became a Red Cross nurse's aide in Toronto, Canada. She started to spend her downtime watching the pilots of the Royal Flying Corps train nearby her tent where she was a nurse. She was immediately intrigued. In January 1921, she began flying lessons with a female instructor by the name of Nita Snook. After a few of these lessons, Amelia Earhart was hooked. She saved up money by working at a telephone company and eventually purchased her first airplane, a Kenner Airster. $80,000 later, and a few months passing by in 1921, passed her flying test and received her National Aeronautics license. And just like that, a legend was in the making. In 1928, she would board a plane and become the first ever female passenger to cross the Atlantic Ocean by aircraft. The years after that she was a passenger in that flight across the ocean, she was determined to take the helm and fly herself into that achievement. So in 1932, Earhart became the first ever woman in history to make a non-stop, solo transatlantic flight. At this time, her fame was rising quickly. She was a household name, and she was awarded the U.S. Distinguished Flying Cross, essentially crowning her as the Queen of the Skies. Earhart was an icon and an inspiration for everybody everywhere, but specifically, the women everywhere. She was a member of the National Women's Party, and she was a huge figurehead for equal rights. She was an advisor on the aeronautical engineering platform at Purdue University, an associate professor, and a pilot herself. She could do it all. And if you were alive in the 20s and 30s, you knew who Amelia Earhart was. She also became very close friends with the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, as well, as if her fame couldn't be more widespread. But all this fame, all this limelight and prestige on the ground was just a byproduct of her actual overarching goal. She loved what she was doing, yes, but just like Billy Joel said, don't you know that only fools are satisfied? Amelia Earhart wanted to fly where no one else had flown before. A flight that would take her all the way around the globe, circumnavigating the entire expanse of it. This was the most impressive aeronautical feat possible, and she knew that she could do it. The first attempt. Some people might not know, but Earhart and two crew members, her navigator and the radio operator, Captain Harry Manning, and the second navigator, Fred Noonan, attempted circumnavigation before her famous disappearance. On March 17, 1937, Earhart and crew set off from Oakland, California, to begin this flight around the world. The first leg was flying from Oakland to Honolulu, Hawaii, and on the flight there, some technical difficulties and mechanical problems with the aircraft began to cause issues with the flight, eventually leading Earhart to touchdown on Luke's Field in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. What was wrong with the aircraft was the propeller hubs. They had seemingly come into some sort of issue, and that's why they had touched down early. 3 days later, and after all those issues had been fixed, the crew was set to take off and aim for a small island in the Pacific called Howland Island. Except this time, Earhart never left the runway. During the takeoff, the forward section of landing gear collapsed, causing the plane to essentially faceplant on the runway, both propellers smacking into the ground and dulling themselves. The real cause of this crash is still not known as an absolute certainty. Many people actually debate if the landing gear even ever had a malfunction, as some people believe the issue was pilot error. Others also believe the aircraft was sabotaged, but whatever the case is, the aircraft was severely damaged, and the attempt to fly around the globe was called off. Earhart's craft was shipped to Lockheed in Burbank for very extensive repairs. And during the time for these repairs, Earhart didn't just sit idly by. She and her husband went on to secure the additional funds in preparation for a second attempt at circumnavigating the world, and they were hopeful that this time they can make it more than 1/5 of the way through. In an attempt to increase their odds, seemingly, the route was changed for this path. This time they would be flying eastbound, leaving from Miami, which is the opposite side of the country from Oakland. After nailing down this new flight pattern, the previous skilled radio operator, Captain Harry Manning, refused to participate in this second attempt of circumnavigating the world due to all the issues that they faced on the first attempt. This choice to sit this one out unknowingly saved his life. And it also marks the first of many blunders made upon this journey. But despite the loss of a great asset like Captain Harry Manning, the flight would go on as scheduled, and Amelia Earhart, Fred Noonan, and the plane the Electra would take flight from Miami and attempt to go as far east as east goes. The second and famous attempt. On the fateful day of June 1st, 1937, Earhart left Miami, Florida to begin the circumnavigation for a second time. The first half of this excursion was very routine. Nothing went awry, and the plane made numerous scheduled stops in other countries and continents. South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and other places as well. And from an outsider's perspective, the flight was going good. There was no news of new mechanical errors that was being reported, and all the fuel stops were normal. Earhart made it all the way to around the New Guinea area on June 29th, 1937. She was just around 22,000 miles into this trip and had less than 7,000 left. These last miles would take place over the most empty part of the Earth, though, the dark, watery expanse of the Pacific Ocean. After a refueling period in New Guinea on July 2nd at 10 in the morning, Earhart took to the sky with the intention of landing on Howland Island. Now, if you remember, the first attempt at circumnavigation saw Earhart and crew fly west to Honolulu and then attempt this flight to Howland Island. The second trip was the exact opposite way and had them flying east to Howland Island. This is an important distinction to make because flying from New Guinea to Howland was longer than flying from Hawaii to Howland. Howland Island itself is nothing remarkable by any stretch of the imagination. The entire island is just 6,500 feet long and 1,600 feet wide, with nothing on it but a very, very small airstrip. This is the largest problem that would arise on the last leg of the trip because it's very hard to spot these small little islands from the sky where Earhart would be. And if there was any fog, clouds, or storms, it would make it that much more difficult. These flying days over the Pacific Ocean were the most grueling parts of this trip, with nothing underneath Earhart but blue abyss for miles. The distance from New Guinea to Howland was almost max capacity of her fuel tanks, so she was pushing it to say the least. Essentially, she had to land on Howland to refuel, or she couldn't make it. You couple that fact with the fact that they were looking for this extremely small piece of land in the middle of the ocean with little to no indicator lights on it or life to speak of, and you get a recipe for disaster. The Vanishing. Now, Earhart was not fully alone in her voyage across no man's land, because in preparation for her arrival to Howland Island, the U.S. Coast Guard sent the cutter, named the USCGC Itasca, over to Howland Island to kind of act as a visual cue and a communication hub for Earhart and Noonan. This way, Earhart could bounce information to and from the vessel and kind of triangulate where Howland Island might be. It's a good plan in theory, right? The cutter would talk to Earhart over the radio and transmit a radio homing signal from the ship, that way she could locate the island. Now, aboard the Electra that Earhart was flying, there was an experimental piece of tech that could have helped her find where she was going. It was essentially a frequency direction finder. Now, this piece of tech was still in its testing phase, but in theory, it would use the radio waves from the ship on Howland Island that would ping towards it, and it would ping them back to get a direction of where the airwaves came from. Except there were two problems. One was that the tech is new, and Earhart really didn't know how to use it well. And two, if you remember Captain Harry Manning, the guy that left the crew after the first failed attempt, he was the expert in operating this communication finder thing. And since he wasn't on the crew anymore, they didn't have the person that would use it in a most efficient way. And so the confusion begins. At around 3 p.m. LAE time, Earhart reported to the cutter that her altitude was about 10,000 feet. But since there was a thick block of clouds rolling in, she was going to reduce her altitude to get better visuals on the island and the water below. 2 hours later, at 5 p.m., she reported being 7,000 feet up and flying at 150 knots. At this point, Noonan and Earhart's transmissions to the ship by Howland Island were clear, and nearly every word could be heard pretty easily. However, the responses from the ship to the plane were not clear. Earhart allegedly was unable to hear voice transmissions from the ship, which implies that the aircraft's direction-finding technology and communication technology just was not working correctly. Before these failed connections, the communication was successful, although some were broken by static. But in the evening, when the ship couldn't get their voices across to Earhart, panic began to set in. She was approaching Howland Island, but they could not talk to her. A radio man on the ship near Howland was famously quoted as saying he was, quote, sitting there sweating blood because I couldn't do a darn thing about it, end quote. More calls were coming in from Earhart as the night turned into day, and at 6:45 a.m., a location and bearing request was sent, and Earhart estimated they were around 100 miles out. They did this through Morse code. An hour later, at 7:30 a.m., a radio log on the ship states that Earhart only had half an hour of fuel left. And following up that log, another log states that Earhart believed she was near the ship, but she could not see it with her own eyes. And if she was near the ship, then she would have been near Howland Island. In that same log, she claimed that she was flying at just 1,000 feet. For reference, that is very low to fly, and you would pretty easily be able to locate things with the naked eye from that distance. Earhart and Noonan were searching desperately for the tiny island of Howland, yet probably all she could see was ocean. With all the other options failing, Earhart sent a transmission at 7:58 saying once again that she could not hear the ship, and she asked for them to keep sending voice signals, that way she could try to use their transmission finder and maybe locate where their direction is. Now, this transmission at 7:58 in the morning is reported to be the loudest and most clear transmission they got from Earhart, indicating herself and Noonan were near and in the surrounding area somewhere, since it was so clear. And since communications back to Earhart were troubled, she asked again for Morse code to be sent through. Using Morse code, Earhart acknowledged that she was receiving the transmissions from the ship, but that she could not hear the ship themselves. At this point, Earhart was losing fuel, she was losing altitude, and she was running out of time. The very last voice transmission received from Earhart indicated that herself and Noonan were flying along a line of position that ran north to south on 157 to 337 degrees. This voice transmission would go down in infamy as the last official words ever spoken by Amelia Earhart on July 2nd, 1937. After all contact ceased from Earhart and Howland Island, many more attempts were made to try to contact the plane. Using Morse code, using voice transmissions, none of it was successful. And thus, the Queen of the Sky was lost, and the race against time to locate her had just begun. The 87-year search effort. The exact cause of the flight's failure and the malfunction of the equipment on board is not 100% known to this day. No exact reason could ever be deduced until the wreckage is found. However, I will be getting into many different thoughts and ideas and theories later in the last portion of the video, so you want to stick around for that. Immediately after communication was lost between Howland Island and Earhart, the US government investigated and began searching for Earhart and Noonan and the plane and everything. At first, rescue teams were pretty hopeful that they would simply find the plane floating in water, with Earhart and Noonan on the wings, waiting for rescue. After all, most planes will float if landed properly with any skill or luck, and Earhart was a skilled pilot. But almost as soon as this search began, just a few hours after communications were lost, nature's fury struck. A Pacific Ocean storm began to ravage the area around Howland Island, with high winds and rain and choppy sea all rolled into one, making that immediate search effort halted. Around the time that the storm was happening, stray radio waves signaling SOS were picked up as far inland in the US as Wyoming. Several people writing down transcriptions of what they thought was Amelia Earhart begging and pleading for help, hearing things like she was stuck in a coral reef or that Noonan might have been injured. These voice messages were heard by hundreds of people, but most of them were thought to be fake. It's unknown if these SOS signals were indeed a joke or if they were Earhart's last plea before sinking under the waves. Despite the storms coming in, approximately only 1 hour after Earhart's last recorded message, the cutter that was near Howland Island began searching north and west of the island for wreckage, combing miles and miles of waves in the process. This immediate search was of course fruitless, as nothing was located. Now, the reason the north and the western areas around the island were specifically targeted was because that is the general area where Earhart's last transmissions were thought to come from. But even then, no one could know for sure. The US Navy began to send reinforcements to bolster the search, and over the next 3 days, ships and planes combed all around the islands and all around the airspace, finding nothing. The official search lasted until July 19th, 1937. Over $4 million was spent funding these searches, which means that at the time, it was the most expensive and intensive search effort in US military history. A search this big had never happened, and despite all of that, no physical evidence of Earhart or Noonan or the plane could be found. Not a single shred of proof that she even went into the water. July the 2nd was the day that Earhart allegedly crashed into the sea with Noonan herself in the plane, and for the next 17 full days is when that search I just talked about ensued. Nothing was found, and the ocean had swallowed everything. After this search was ended by the government and the military, another search by Earhart's husband began immediately after this one. Putnam, who is Earhart's husband, financed a private search through these local island authorities nearby who might have known the area better. However, nothing was found. Years later, in 2003, a man named David Jordan used his own company, Nauticos, to search a 1,200 square mile radius north and west of Howland with a deep-sea sonar device. Sending this device out and operating this device costed over $4.5 million. And again, no wreckage and no evidence was found. And very recently, this year in 2024, a company out of South Carolina called Deep Sea Vision set out another search, trying to find Earhart or anything that could relate to the disappearance. Deep Sea Vision is a company that controls these unmanned underwater vehicles to search for marine life and wreckage. Using sonar, they actually ended up finding what they claimed to be the remains of an airplane on the ocean floor near Howland Island. The object they found on sonar is shaped like Earhart's plane, the Electra, and it was detected at 16,000 feet underwater. The exact coordinates and location of this alleged wreckage has not been given to the public for obvious reasons, because they're still looking into these findings before all information goes out. But what the company has released is that the wreckage is within 100 miles of Howland Island. More info is currently being attained by Deep Sea Vision to see if they actually had found the Electra, which means that we might be very close to a breakthrough. Or not. Since that evidence is not concrete, much speculation has been done, and now I will dive into that speculation and the theories and conspiracies and discrepancies on what happened to Earhart and where she's at. Theories on where Earhart is. As you might imagine, the leading theory among the public, as well as the experts surrounding the case, is that Amelia Earhart and crew crashed into the Pacific Ocean and sank to the bottom. The theory states that the plane wreckage should be somewhere around Howland Island, and this is supported by her last radio transmission coming to the Navy being the clearest it ever was, as well as her estimated distance out from the island, stating she was close to the island. This theory is really cut and clean and dry, but it's also not without its loose ends. If she did indeed crash near Howland, why wasn't any evidence of her plane found in the very extensive search that happened just hours after they lost contact? No oil slick, no gear, no metal, no bodies, nothing. And for the next 80 years, there was also nothing. And when Earhart's husband funded an expedition to find wreckage around the island, nothing was found either. Even if this crew in 2024 from Deep Sea Vision did end up locating the wreckage 87 years later, how did it not happen sooner? This was the biggest search done by the US military ever, and they didn't find anything. Because of these flaws in this leading theory, several conspiracies have been brought forward that might explain what happened. I want to touch on all of them now in order of least outlandish to most outlandish, and I want you in the comments section to tell me which one you believe happened. The most popular conspiracy is called the Gardner Island Hypothesis. This theory assumes that Earhart and Noonan were unable to find Howland Island, since it's so small, so they flew south to look for other places to land on one of the other smaller islands, eventually finding Gardner Island, which is now known as Nikumaroro. Many people think that they might have crashed near or on this island and swam ashore. And there's actually minor bits of evidence to support this theory as well. Many reports you find say that there was no evidence found on any searches of Gardner Island that might lead to Earhart or Noonan being here at all. But that's false because searches of the island have shown otherwise. A week after Earhart's vanishing, the Navy flew over the island and cited that there was signs of recent habitation, but there was no downed plane, no smokes, no oil slick, or anything like that, and because of this, the island was not searched. But years later, searches of the island turned up some interesting clues. In 1940, around 3 years after Earhart's vanishing, British searchers were exploring the island of Gardner, and they ended up finding 13 pieces of skeletal remains. They also found a piece of plexiglass that could have been from the Electra's window. They also found a woman's shoe that dates to the 1930s, as well as several improvised tools and a women's cosmetics jar from the 30s as well. The bones, of course, were the most interesting find, and to be sure they might have been Earhart's, they were shipped to Fiji for analysis. And they were subsequently lost. And I say lost in a loose sense, of course, because they very well might have actually been the remains of Earhart or Noonan, and someone didn't want the public knowing about it. But we'll truly never know. As many of you know or have heard, this theory often has another, darker, more grotesque part to it. You see, Nikumaroro is home to a species of giant coconut crab. Now, these are land-dwelling crabs that have been known to hunt and to kill large birds for food pretty regularly. Charles Darwin himself declared these coconut crabs as monstrous. They can regularly be longer than 3 feet, which is massive. They get the name coconut crab from their ability to rip open coconuts with their claws, but as stated, they do also eat birds, as well as rats or mice. Anyways, this theory, as it pertains to Earhart, states that Earhart or Noonan or both made it to the island after crashing nearby, but they were too weak or too injured to move around too much or to do anything else to help themselves out. So in their weakened state, the coconut crabs slowly but surely began to feast on them. Alive or not, every inch of flesh would have been picked clean by the ravenous crabs. These things are everywhere on the island, so it's not like it's just a freak accident, and they're known to eat flesh all the time, so it's not too outlandish. Of course, this would leave the question, where are the rest of the bones, since only 13 were found, and humans have way more than that? The answer might lie in how coconut crabs actually strip carcasses for food. You see, they rip their prey into bits and chunks, and then they take that piece back to their hole to feast on. They don't just do it in the open, they take it all the way back to their lair. These holes, of course, are underground, and effectively act like graves. So if 10 or 11 crabs tore different pieces of Earhart off and took them back to their own respective holes in the ground to eat her later on over the next few weeks, the bones of Earhart would have been underground and not visible to searchers. It would be as if the crabs dug the grave and then buried her. In 2018, sniff dogs that were trained to find human bones and remains were sent to the island to search around for more than those 13 bones. Since the original bones were lost, people were eager to see if there could be any more findings. Some people on that expedition claimed that the dogs did indeed sniff out possible bone locations, but National Geographic has since refuted that claim in recent years because no physical evidence was found. Nevertheless, the Gardner Island hypothesis has its merits. Whether it's the crabs, whether it's not, whether they just got marooned there and got kidnapped or whatever, it would be a horrible way to go out. Another theory is the Japanese capture theory. Now, this assumes that Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese forces because they flew into Japanese airspace, or they could have crashed and were picked up by Japanese ships first. Interestingly enough, a large number of Earhart's relatives actually believe that this is the case. They think that the Japanese were involved because there were eyewitness encounters that arose from Japanese troops that claimed to see Earhart in custody. Those claims are unverifiable though, and the leading problem with this theory is that the plane really didn't have enough fuel to make it into Japanese territory. It would have needed hundreds of more miles. Plus, if they crashed and Japanese found them first, the Japanese would have had motivation to rescue them because Earhart was really famous and her journey was worldwide news. And if she was rescued by the Japanese, it would have branded them as heroes to the world. So that theory is slightly less likely, in my opinion. Lastly, and most bizarrely, is the theory that the plane never went down, but in fact, Earhart survived, got back to the USA, and took on an entire different identity. In November of 2006, the National Geographic Channel aired an episode of Undiscovered History that claimed that Earhart circumnavigated the world successfully, but upon landing, changed her name, remarried, and assumed the identity of an Irene Craigmile Bolam. This claim originates from a book called Amelia Earhart Lives, which is based on research by Major Joseph Gervais. More on him in a second. Irene Bolam was a woman born in 1904, and she was an investment banker that lived in New Jersey. And in 1965, Joseph Gervais, the author of the Earhart Lives book, was invited to speak at a retired pilots gathering, since he himself was a major in the United States Air Force. At this gathering, one of Earhart's friends was there named Viola. Viola then introduced Gervais to Mrs. Irene Bolam. Upon glancing at her for 1 second, Gervais instantly felt that he recognized her in some way, and then it clicked in his head that she looked like an older version of Amelia Earhart. Now, 1965 was 30 years after Earhart went missing, but to Gervais, this was an uncanny resemblance. Gervais claims that upon having a conversation with Bolam, she said that she was a member of the 99s and the Zonta International Group, which both were co-founded by Earhart. But after this event, when Gervais checked the rosters of these groups, neither the 99s or the Zonta International Group showed an Irene Bolam as a member. Was this woman lying? Was she Amelia Earhart? Or did she just misspeak? According to Gervais, this Irene Bolam was also wearing pageantry that only Amelia Earhart had, and not herself. The entire situation seemed off to him. These strange happenings, plus Bolam's similarities physically to Earhart, prompted Gervais to dive into what might be going on here. Gervais would then dive deeply into research, which would eventually promote to the book Amelia Earhart Lives. After this book was written and after all these things were researched, Bolam took legal action and actually denied the claim publicly that she was Amelia Earhart. But several discrepancies still loomed overhead. If you take a picture of Earhart and you digitally age her up the 35-ish years that would have passed between the wreckage and this meeting, she looks remarkably similar to Bolam. Now, this study of age progression was done by Mike Streed of the Orange County Police Department in Southern California. Streed began with a photograph of when Earhart was 37 and then merged features from older women and her own family to show what she might have looked like with an age-progressive photo at around 75 years old. This image and a current image of Bolam side by side are very uncanny and strange looking to say the least. They share similar features like forehead ridges, eyebrow ridges, teeth gaps, and overall facial structure. All of this information was in Gervais's research and in the book Earhart Lives, and that is what caused Bolam to press charges against him in the book. However, these charges were thrown out when Bolam was asked to provide fingerprints in front of a judge to prove that she was not Earhart, to which she denied. She refused to do these fingerprints, which definitely leads to speculation. Why would she not simply provide fingerprints if she knew that she was not Amelia Earhart? It would be a very easy way to discredit all the claims that she was. And even more mysteriously, when Bolam died in 1982, she donated her body to science, but left strict instructions that she was not to be fingerprinted or otherwise identified. She was then cremated, and her ashes were put in a common, unmarked grave, and on her death certificate, her parents were listed as unknown. And if you think that's crazy, the theory doesn't even stop there, because further investigation from Gervais and others turned up a secret meeting that occurred with Earhart and two of President FDR's principal advisors before she circumnavigated the globe. This meeting was off the books, completely secret, completely private, and it happened at the March Army Corps Field in April of 1937. The two advisors were Bernard Baruch and Chief Oscar Westover. These two and Earhart did this meeting at the Air Force Base, and this meeting took place about 1 month after Earhart failed the first circumnavigating attempt. Now, whatever happened in this meeting seemed to have big changes on Earhart's plans. You see, because it was shortly after this meeting, after April, that Earhart decided to change her flight pattern, and instead of going again the original west method, flying from Oakland to Hawaii, she would now fly east from Miami, the exact opposite directions. Now, this change in flight path made the last leg of the journey much more difficult, because that overwater flight to Howland Island would now be 2,556 miles from New Guinea, and not the original 1,900 miles that it was from Hawaii. So why would she make this choice if it made the already hardest part of the flight even harder? Now, Gervais then dove headfirst into this theory and states that the US government was using Earhart to get access to the Marshall Islands that were being controlled by Japanese forces. Now, as outlandish as this sounds, and is, there were two decent plans theorized by Gervais when this meeting was uncovered on what Earhart might have actually been doing. One was that Earhart would leave Howland Island on a secret fly to Niahu Island, which is a private island off of Hawaii. This would take her nearer the Marshall Islands. While here, she would then falsely claim that she was having engine trouble and that she was going to try to make it to one of the Marshall Islands to land. Then, while approaching the islands, she would go radio silent and not answer any communications with anyone. At this point, she would be declared missing, and this would give the US government an excuse to poke and to prod into the Marshall Islands to look for her and to establish a presence there. That sounds like something the US government would do, since we had no presence in those islands at that time. But the other theory is kind of more similar to what actually happened. This theory states that Earhart would fail, quote-unquote, to find Howland Island, and that she would go radio silent and stop answering any communications with anybody, and head directly for the Marshall Islands. After doing this, she would land somewhere and wait for the Navy to come and find her and take her back. except the plan might have went awry and she crashed, or the Japanese found her, or the crabs ate her, or something like that. Both of these proposed plans would give the USA a reason and an excuse to insinuate themselves in the Marshall Islands and do reconnaissance and establish a presence there, since we didn't have any information on it or any knowledge about it at the time. Who knows if this theory is true or if Gervais is crazy, but it's definitely plausible and it definitely piques my interest to think about. But if that theory isn't true, and Amelia did come back to the US and just assumed the new identity of Irene, even more support for that comes from a stranger place. Roland C. Reinick, who is the author of the book Earhart Survived, picked up the search again in 1991 when he got a lead that took him to New Jersey to interview a man named James Francis Kelly, an 89-year-old retired psychologist who affirmed heavily that he had been commissioned by the then Archbishop Francis Joseph Spellman to bring Amelia Earhart home after her circumnavigation to the US and give her a new identity. As well as James Francis Kelly stating this, two of his inner circle friends also claimed to know that Bolam was actually Amelia Earhart. Helen Barber, one of his two friends, said that, quote, she was adamant that she no longer wanted to be identified as Amelia Earhart. Kelly gave no reason for her inflexibility in this regard, but said only that this was her very strong demand, end quote. So pretty much, this psychologist stated that he was commissioned by the Archbishop Francis Joseph Spellman to kind of make a new life and a new identity for Amelia Earhart once she got home and once the US government and military's ambitions in the islands were quenched. James Francis Kelly died in 1996, and upon his death, a few noteworthy items were actually located in his possession. One was a folder with Irene Bolam written on one side and Amelia Earhart written on the other side. There was also a note nearby that read, quote, it's too bad that her mother never knew she'd survived, end quote. Why would Kelly write any of this if there was no truth in it? Was he insane? Was he crazy? Did he have false leads? We don't know. But between the theories by Roland Reinick, Joe Gervais, and James Francis Kelly, it is a possibility that she survived and hid from the outer world for the rest of her days. But even with all of this, even with all this information together, the question still remains as to why. She had never shied away from the public eye before. She was a figurehead for women's rights, was famous, and was literally a role model for the entire country and the world. Why would she not want to come back? And why would she want to hide from this huge success of circumnavigating the world? So many questions and no concrete answers. Perhaps the government forced her to do something she didn't want to do, and when she got back, she could not be in the public eye after what she did. That would make sense if Gervais's theory of the government using her as a pawn to get into the Marshall Islands was true. But then again, we still don't know. In conclusion, Amelia Earhart is truly the embodiment of an American legend. Fighting for equality, being just a general badass pilot, and showing the world what the indomitable human spirit is capable of. It's a really shameful thought that her achievements and her victories are often overlooked due to the controversy of her crash and the conspiracies surrounding it. Now, if this recent search that happened in 2024 actually turns up that the plane that she flew is just right there by Howland Island, then we can put all these conspiracies to bed. However, until that day comes, there is no one true answer to the Amelia Earhart discrepancy. Where did she go? Why was no wreckage found? Where is Noonan's body? Where is Earhart's body? Where is the Electra? Was the government in on this? Did they just want to use her as a pawn to get to the Marshall Islands for reconnaissance? And was she so ashamed for doing this that she came back to the country and assumed the identity of Irene Bolam? These are the discrepancies that make this conspiracy crumble. And to this day, there is no concrete information that swings either way. It seems that every single aspect, every single conspiracy has its own merits and also has its own holes. The likelihood that she crashed into the Pacific is equally as likely as any of these conspiracy theories. We can only hope that one day concrete answers will be provided to us as the public, but I honestly doubt that they ever will. The Queen of the Sky will truly live on forever, even if her current whereabouts are uncertain. May she find peace wherever she is, and may God rest her soul. Thank you all for watching this little mini documentary into the discrepancies in the Earhart case. I've been working on this video for about 2 months now, and during that time, this channel has hit 100,000 subscribers, which is, honestly, guys, I love you all so much. This is utterly insane. Thank you so much. This is the Spoogly channel. This is my 3rd channel, and it's just a purely investigative passion project for me. It just really scratches the itches in my brain for creating and making these documentaries and video editing and research. I just love this stuff, and the fact that you all stick around to watch it makes it so much more worth it. So thank you a ton. There's so much more to come for this channel. The videos are just going to continue to get better and better and longer and more comprehensive and everything like that. Make sure to stick around if you want to stay for the next milestones. And if you do end up wanting to support this video, just leave a like on the video. It is free and it really just helps with the algorithm to send out this thing to others. Also makes me smile. So if you want to see videos like this in your feed more, then you can subscribe. Again, it's free to do so. And those are just the best ways to support the channel. I don't have Patreon, I don't have any of that stuff. The best way you can do so is just by watching the videos. And support is very appreciated since I personally do all the research, the scripting, the editing. There is no team here. This is just me doing all this myself while running my main channel, Broogly, and my other channel, Toogly. But you know, it's just this awesome, fulfilling experience to run this channel. Thank you so much for sticking around. I cannot wait to see what happens next. Most of all, I hope that you had a great day, and I want you to remember to tell people that you love them, because life is too short not to. With all that said, I will see you in the next video. Peace and love.